My parents cut me off for marrying my spouse, but now they're seeking to reconnect with me after I became pregnant. I, 28F, have always had a problematic connection with my parents, particularly when it comes to their expectations for my future. Growing up in a privileged suburb, I was always compared to my older sister Amber, 30F, who excelled at everything she did, earning straight A's in school and eventually becoming a successful lawyer at a famous company in New York. In contrast, I was a more free-spirited individual. I did well in school, but I favored art and literature over science and maths, which my parents prized so highly. Our family is from old money. My father, Richard, 60M, is a reasonably affluent person, and my mother, Rose, 58F, comes from an equally wealthy family and spends the most of her time volunteering for various charities. To be honest, I'm more interested in the social component than genuine giving. They've always been obsessed with preserving our social standing and connections. My parents planned out my entire life from the day I was born. I was supposed to attend an Ivy League school, preferably Harvard, like my father, study in business or law, marry someone from a good family, which meant they were both affluent and well-connected, and eventually take over the family business with Amber. But that is not the life I envisioned for myself. I've always been more interested in the arts. I enjoyed painting, writing poetry, and visiting the city's museums. My parents saw these pursuits as cute hobbies, but nothing to base a career on. They pushed me into extracurricular activities they thought were more appropriate, such as tennis lessons and internships at my father's firm during summer breaks. I went along with it all to maintain the peace, but I never felt like I genuinely fit into the world they envisioned for me. When I was accepted to Brown University, my parents were disappointed that it wasn't Harvard but believed it was okay. They hoped that surrounding me with the right people would finally put me on the road they had always envisioned for me. They had no idea that it would bring me to the person who would forever transform my life. I met Chad, 29M, in my sophomore year in college. We practically ran into each other in the campus coffee shop. I was racing to go to class and didn't see where I was going, while he was leaving with a tray full of coffee for his study group. The accident caused hot coffee to fly everywhere, ruining both of our clothes. Instead of becoming irritated, Chad simply chuckled and replied, "Well, I guess this is one way to break the ice." We ended up skipping our lectures and spending hours conversing. Chad was everything my parents would dislike, which made him the more enticing to me. He hailed from a working-class family in a tiny town in Ohio. His father was a manufacturing worker, and his mother worked as a waitress. Chad was attending Brown on a full scholarship and working part-time to support himself. He was studying to be a teacher because he loved education and wanted to make a difference in the lives of children. From our first meeting, I felt Chad was something unique. He was friendly, amusing, and extremely hard-working. He had a unique ability to make me feel noticed and understood. With Chad, I could be myself, not the polished, flawless daughter my parents wanted me to be, but the true me, with all my idiosyncrasies and flaws. We started dating, and it was the first time in my life I felt genuinely happy. Chad encouraged my creativity, pushed me to pursue my dreams, and supported me in ways that my family never did. When I informed him about my desire to become a graphic designer, he did not scoff or disregard it as my parents had. Instead, he assisted me in researching programs and internship opportunities. Of course, my parents despised him from the moment they met him. It happened during Parents' Weekend of our junior year. I had been putting off introducing them since I knew it would not go well, but I couldn't do it any longer. The meeting was a fiasco from the beginning. My folks couldn't see beyond Chad's background. To them, he was just a poor youngster attempting to go up the social ladder by dating me. They regularly made disparaging remarks about his attire, which were not designer labels, his faint Midwestern accent, and his profession choice. My mother kept asking him whether he was certain he wanted to be a teacher when there were so many other respectable jobs available. My father scarcely recognized Chad's presence, speaking exclusively to me and expressing his disapproval. It didn't matter to them that Chad treated me better than any of the trust money boys they tried to introduce me to. They were persuaded that he merely wanted our money and social standing. When I tried to defend Chad, citing his scholarship and work ethic, my father dismissively responded, "Oh honey, don't be naive. Boys like that are seldom without an angle." Despite my parents' displeasure, Chad and I continued to date throughout college. We encouraged each other throughout late-night study sessions, celebrated our accomplishments together, and discussed our future goals. With Chad, I felt like I could be myself and follow my own path, not the one my parents had planned for me. After graduation, Chad proposed. It wasn't the large, lavish occasion that my folks had expected. We were on a weekend camping vacation, which my folks would never comprehend, and we were sitting by the campfire beneath a starry night sky. Chad turned to me and said, "I know I can't give you the luxurious life you grew up with, but I promise to love and support you in everything you do. Will you marry me?" I agreed without hesitation. When we returned from our trip and I informed my folks, all hell broke loose. My mother fell into tears, lamenting how I was wasting my life. My father's face turned an alarming shade of red as he raged about how I was making the worst decision of my life. They accused me of being dumb and short-sighted. My mother urged, "Think about your future. How will you keep your current lifestyle? How about your children? Don't you want them to have the finest of everything?" I attempted to explain that Chad and I had discussed our future, that we had plans in place, and that we were prepared for any challenges that might arise. But they would not listen. To them, marrying Chad meant choosing a life of poverty and misery. When I refused to call off the engagement, they issued an ultimatum. Either I terminate things with Chad, or they cut me off entirely. There will be no more financial help, trust funds, inheritances, or anything. If you're so set on living like a commoner, then you can do it without our money, my father said. I was shocked by their reaction. I knew they wouldn't be thrilled, but I never expected them to go this far. In that moment, I realized that their love and support had always been conditional. As long as I did what they wanted and fit into their narrow view of success, I was their daughter. But the moment I chose my own path, they were willing to cast me aside. I chose Chad. We got married in a small ceremony with just a few close friends present. It was nothing like the lavish society wedding my parents had always thought for me. But it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Amber didn't even show up to the wedding. She sided with our parents, telling me I was making a huge mistake. The day after my wedding, I received a cold, formal letter from my parents' lawyer. It informed me that I had been removed from their will, and that Amber was now the sole heir to their fortune. It also stated that I was no longer welcome in the family home, and that any future attempts to contact my parents would be dealt with legally. It hurt more than I could have imagined. Not because of the money. Chad and I were both working and managing just fine, but because my own family had chosen their outdated beliefs and social status over my happiness. The parents who had raised me, who I thought loved me unconditionally, had thrown me away because I didn't fit into their perfect mold. For 3 years we had no contact. I tried reaching out a few times in the beginning, sending letters and leaving voicemails on holidays and birthdays. But my attempts at reconciliation went unanswered. Eventually I stopped trying. During those 3 years, Chad and I built a life together. We both worked hard, me as a graphic designer for a small advertising agency, and Chad as a high school English teacher. We bought a small house in a modest neighborhood, adopted a rescue dog named Max, and were genuinely happy. Sure, we didn't have the luxuries I grew up with. We couldn't afford fancy vacations or designer clothes, and we had to budget carefully to make ends meet. But we had love, and respect for each other, which was worth more than any amount of money. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living authentically, pursuing my own dreams instead of someone else's expectations. 3 years after our wedding, I found out I was pregnant. Chad and I were over the moon. We hadn't been actively trying, but we both wanted kids and were excited to start this new chapter in our lives. We decided to wait until after the first trimester to start telling people, just to be safe. About a week after we started sharing the news with our friends, I received a text message from Amber. It was the first time I'd heard from her in 3 years. The message was short and to the point. "Mom and Dad heard about the baby. They want to talk. Call them." I was shocked. How did they even find out? I hadn't told anyone in my family, and as far as I knew, we didn't have any mutual friends who would have passed on the information. After discussing it with Chad, I decided to call them. Maybe, I thought, the idea of becoming grandparents had softened their hearts. I called them, and my mother answered on the second ring. The conversation was awkward. My mother did most of the talking, while I could hear my father breathing heavily in the background, occasionally grunting in agreement. She congratulated me on the pregnancy and then, without any reason, started talking about how they wanted to make amends and be part of their grandchild's life. There was no apology for how they had treated me, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. It was as if the last 3 years of silence had never happened. But then my mother started talking about sending us some gifts for the baby. Before I could say anything, she kept talking about a list of things they wanted to buy: a top-of-the-line stroller, a custom-made crib, designer baby clothes, even a new car suitable for a family. I was stunned. The gifts she was describing would easily cost over $10,000. It felt less like a peace offering and more like they were trying to buy their way back into my life, and my child's life. When I tried to politely decline, saying Chad and I had already started preparing for the baby, my mother got upset. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "You can't possibly provide for this child the way we can. We're just trying to help. Don't let your pride get in the way of giving your baby the best start in life." The conversation ended with my mother saying they would send the gifts anyway, and that they expected to be involved in their grandchild's life. She didn't once ask how I was feeling, how my pregnancy was going, or even how Chad was doing. It was all about the gifts and their expectations. After I hung up, Chad was furious when I told him about the conversation. He felt like my parents were trying to undermine us, to show that they could provide things for our child that we couldn't. They're trying to buy their way into our lives, he said, pacing around our small living room. And once we accept these gifts, they'll use it as leverage to make demands about how we raise our child. I knew Chad had a point, but a small part of me still hoped that maybe this was just my parents' clumsy way of trying to reconnect. Maybe if we gave them a chance, they would come around and accept Chad and our life together. Maybe they've changed, I said, though I didn't really believe it. Maybe becoming grandparents has made them realize what's truly important. Chad looked at me and said, "Do you really believe that? Or are you just hoping it's true because you miss them?" His words hit home. I did miss my family, despite everything. I missed the good times, family dinners, holiday celebrations, inside jokes that only we understood. But I also couldn't forget the bad times, the constant pressure, the disapproval, the way they had cast me aside when it didn't conform to their expectations. Chad says he'll support whatever decision I make, but I can tell he's uncomfortable with the idea of accepting anything from my parents. He's worried that they'll try to exert control over our lives and our child's upbringing. We've been doing fine on our own, he reminds me. We don't need their money or their approval. Amber has been blowing up my phone, alternating between guilt-tripping me for holding a grudge and excitedly talking about being an aunt. She doesn't seem to understand why I'm hesitating to accept our parents' offer. They're trying to make things right, she insists. Why can't you just let the past go? But it's not that simple. The past isn't just the past, it's shaped who I am and the life I've chosen. So, Reddit, what should I do here? I really need some good advice on what to do. Update 1, it's been about a month since my last post, and a lot has happened. First, I want to thank everyone for their advice and support. After much discussion with Chad, we decided to decline my parents' offer of gifts. It wasn't an easy decision, but we felt it was the right one for our family. I called my mother and explained that while we appreciated the gesture, we weren't comfortable accepting such expensive gifts. I tried to keep the conversation civil and suggested that if they wanted to be part of our child's life, we could start with smaller steps, maybe a dinner together to talk things through. My mother didn't take it well. She accused me of being ungrateful and stubborn, saying I was depriving my child of opportunities out of spite. "You're making a huge mistake," she said. "You will be sad if your child grows up without the benefits we can provide." I stayed firm, however. I underlined that Chad and I could care for our child, and that all we needed from them was a connection, not financial assets. My mother finished the conversation by hanging up on me. I thought that was the end of it, but I was mistaken. A few days later, a truck arrived at our house carrying everything my mother had promised, including the pram, cot, baby clothes, and even a set of keys to a new automobile parked on our street. There was a note for our grandchild. "We will not let your stubbornness deprive them the best." Chad and I were astonished. We had no notion what to do with all of this stuff. It felt like a breach of our boundaries. We decided to store everything in the garage until we figured out what to do. Chad wanted to send everything back right away, but I hesitated. The situation became more problematic when Amber showed up at our house the next day. She was overjoyed with the baby and the gifts, as if nothing had ever gone wrong between us. "Isn't it wonderful?" she gushed. "Mom and Dad are really excited to be grandparents. They want to do whatever they can to help." I tried to explain our viewpoint to her, but she did not seem to understand. "Why are you being so difficult?" she asked. "Most individuals would be thrilled to get such wonderful gifts. You're acting as if Mom and Dad are the villains here." The conversation quickly developed into an argument. Amber accused me of being selfish and holding on to past grievances. "They're striving to apologize," she insisted. "Why can't you just accept their love and move on?" At that point, I lost my cool. "Love?" I said. "Is that what you call ignoring me for 3 years and then attempting to buy their way back into my life?" "That's not love, Amber. That is control." Amber left in a huff, warning me that I was making a huge mistake. "You're going to push them away for good this time," she warned. ... And it'll be your fault when your child grows up without grandparents to complicate matters further. Word has gotten out to our extended family about the situation. I've been receiving calls and messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all urging me to reconcile with my parents. "They're your parents," my Aunt Sharon said during one particularly frustrating call. Of course they want to spoil their grandchild. "Why are you fighting this so hard?" I tried to explain about the years of no contact, about how this felt less like a genuine attempt at reconciliation and more like an attempt to buy their way back into our lives. But it's hard to make people understand who haven't lived through it. Chad stood by my side, supporting my decisions while also offering a different perspective when needed. We don't need their money, he reminds me. We're doing fine on our own. Our child will have everything they need, love, support, and 2 parents who adore them. I'm now 16 weeks pregnant, and instead of enjoying this special time, I feel stressed and conflicted. The gifts are still sitting in our garage, a reminder of the decision we have to make. Chad wants to donate everything to a local women's shelter, but I'm hesitating. Once we do that, it feels like we're closing the door on any possibility of reconciliation. Amber keeps sending me pictures of baby clothes and nursery ideas, acting as if nothing is wrong. My parents haven't reached out directly since the gifts arrived, but I know they're waiting for a response. The pressure from family members continues, with new calls and messages every day. As my pregnancy progresses, I know we need to make a decision soon. We can't leave those gifts in the garage forever, and we need to start preparing for the baby's arrival. But every time I think I've made up my mind, I start second-guessing myself. Chad and I have talked about seeing a family counselor to help us navigate this situation. Maybe an outside perspective could help us find a way forward that we haven't thought of yet. For now, we're taking it one day at a time. I'm trying to focus on the positive aspects of my pregnancy and our life together, but the family drama is always there in the background. I just hope that whatever decision we make, it's the right one for our child. Final update: it's been 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share the outcome of our situation. A lot has changed, and I've come to some difficult but necessary decisions. After weeks of agonizing over what to do, Chad and I decided to see a family counselor. We had several sessions, both together and individually, to work through our feelings about the situation with my parents. The counselor helped us gain clarity on our priorities and values, and how to set healthy boundaries. During this time, the pressure from my family intensified. My parents, apparently frustrated by our lack of response, started showing up at our house unannounced. They'd knock on the door for hours, calling out that they just wanted to talk. It was incredibly stressful, especially as my pregnancy progressed and I was dealing with the physical discomfort that came with it. Amber continued her campaign of guilt-tripping, sending daily messages about how I was tearing the family apart. She even went as far as to threaten to cut me out of her life if I didn't reconcile with our parents, even though we weren't really talking for the past few years. The turning point came when I was about 32 weeks pregnant. My parents showed up at my workplace, causing a scene in the lobby. They were demanding to see me, saying they had a right to be involved in their grandchild's life. My coworkers were uncomfortable, and my boss had to ask them to leave, or he'd call the police. That incident made me realize that my parents hadn't changed at all. They were still trying to control my life, disregarding my boundaries and wishes. It wasn't about love or reconciliation, it was about getting their way, no matter the cost. After discussing it with Chad and our counselor, we made the difficult decision to go no contact with my parents and Amber. We sent a formal cease and desist letter through a lawyer, stating that any further attempts to contact us would be considered harassment. We donated all the baby gifts to a local women's shelter, as Chad had suggested months ago. It was hard to let go of them, but it felt like the right thing to do. We didn't want our child's life to start with strings attached. The day after we sent the letter, I blocked my parents and Amber on all platforms. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most liberating. The constant stress and anxiety I'd been feeling started to lift almost immediately. Our daughter, Susan, was born 2 months ago. The birth was complicated, and there were moments when I wished I had my mother there. But Chad was amazing throughout the whole process, and we got through it together. These first few weeks of parenthood have been challenging but incredibly rewarding. Susan is perfect, and watching Chad with her makes me fall in love with him all over again. We may not have all the fancy things my parents wanted to give us, but we have love, and that's more than enough. Looking at Susan, I'm more certain than ever that we made the right choice. I want her to grow up in a home filled with love and respect, not constant judgment and attempts at control. I want her to know that her worth isn't tied to money or status, but to who she is as a person. Yes, she won't have the materialistic advantages my parents could have provided, but she'll have parents who love her unconditionally, who support her dreams whatever they may be. She'll grow up knowing that it's okay to set boundaries, to stand up for herself, and to choose her own path in life. This journey has been difficult, but I don't regret our decision. We're moving forward, focusing on our little family and the bright future ahead of us. Thank you to everyone who has supported us through this journey. Your advice and kind words have meant more than you know. Here's to new beginnings and choosing happiness, even when it's the harder path.